My name is Alec Murphy. I'm on the geography faculty at the University of Oregon, and I'm Senior Vice President of the American Geographical Society. And I'm here with my University of Oregon colleague, Laura Pulido, on the occasion of her receipt of the Cullum Medal, one of the American Geographical Society's most prestigious medals. First, just congratulations, Laura. It's just great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the recognition and all the work of the people who made this happen.
So, the Cullum Medal goes back to 1896, and it was a medal that was founded at the time to honor contributions to geographic exploration and discovery. Obviously, what geographic exploration and discovery meant in 1896 is different from what it means today, but the work you've done in environmental justice and focusing attention on how geographical circumstances reflect and shape inequality, particularly racial inequality, is path-breaking. It's exploration in the sense that it helps us understand the world in which we live. And it kind of seems particularly appropriate that you're receiving this medal at this year's Geography 2050 conference, given that the theme of the conference itself is inequality. So I wonder if we could just start our conversation today by your reflecting a little bit on just how you see inequality relating to the work you've done, how foundational that concept is to your work.
Thanks. I really hear you when you talk about how much exploration has changed, over the time of this award. And in some ways, I still like to do old-fashioned field work also, which is exploring places that are well known, but with a different kind of lens. So anyway, to answer your question, the centrality of equality to my work. So, I grew up in a time, I was born in 1962, and during that time, the term Mexican was considered pejorative, right? It was considered to be an insult. And so very early on, I understood that as a kid, and I was like, really, why is that the case, right? I wanted to understand why me, my family, and people in that way, we were looked down upon, right, by the larger white society. And so that was always a question burning in my heart. And so I brought that kind of consciousness and set of concerns to the classroom when I first became, my first geography class was at a community college as a California geography class. And I was just, wow, I was kind of just really taken by the topics we discussed. But for me, there was always they were not really foregrounding questions of inequality and justice. And so I knew how am I going to bring my agenda to this larger discipline of geography? And so I always came in with that kind of orientation. And my first, I think, first kind of decades of my scholarship was all about, of course, environmental justice. And that really started with the question first, nobody had studied different communities of color for the most part and what their environmental experiences were. So that was just part of the agenda. But then as the concept of environmental justice evolved and developed, I was very committed to understanding why do these inequalities exist? How do we get this kind of landscape? What the different kinds of the political, economic, social factors that created those things? And I was not so interested necessarily in what are the solutions, I confess, but really interested in why. And also interested in how do we talk about it? Because what I saw was huge amounts of denial on the part of social scientists, including some geographers, as well as policymakers, no, there's no problem. There's all kinds of rationalizations and forms of denial about racial inequality. So that kind of obsessed me for a very long period of time.
Were there some seminal works that you were inspired by, or that you talked about, of course, your community college experience, and then, going on from there, obviously you pursued work in geography, and I'm sure that just the teaching of classes made you think about some of these inequality work issues. But, was there some line of scholarship that you thought, oh, this is particularly exciting and I want to try to sort of follow in this line, or did you see yourself just kind of breaking into brand new territory?
That's a good question. A little bit of both, So I wrote my dissertation in the late 1980s, just as the concept of environmental justice was developing. So there was not, it was very easy to master the literature at that point in time because it was so small. It's certainly not the case today. So in some ways, I did draw on, a couple of key works. But really, I was mostly trying to piece it together from other disciplines. So I was working very heavily in drawing heavily on social movement literature, like from sociology. I was, of course, doing lots of work in Chicano studies. Also, kind of history. I was always very drawn to history to try to explain the present. You're well aware of that in your own work. So those were the things from outside of geography. Within geography, I was looking at all these other kinds of studies and analyses and thinking to myself, well, why aren't they foregrounding these questions about race and equality? They're interesting questions, they're important issues, we all need to be paying attention to them, but there was very limited attention, I think, on the part of geography, initially, very, very early on.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think back on how you're thinking about all these issues developed and evolved. I think there's no surprise that, of course, you were getting a lot of insights from other disciplines, but of course what you brought also was this sense of how things are on the ground, that sort of geographical sensibility that I think was so key. It was grafting those things together that was kind of so key in launching you in the direction that you ended up taking, and really being such an influential figure that in the whole world of socio-spatial inequality and environmental justice.
I think that is true. I don't want to, other social scientists do this too. Don't want to claim, new ground there. But I did do, lots of field work, participant observation, ethnographic research, historical archival research to try to understand very specific kind of situations, why they exist, and then what can we extrapolate from them also in terms of potentially larger, different kinds of contexts and different kinds of scenarios. One of the things that I think that has made my work powerful, if I can say that, is in fact the degree to which I do draw on other disciplines and I bring that to geography. I know I have historically done that, but that was, I don't think that's, it was a particular moment in time in geography when geographers were not necessarily innovating and theorizing around questions about race. So they were doing some definitely important work and empirical studies, but the theory at that time was all coming from other disciplines. And I really also carried on that tradition, and in particular I brought in ethnic studies, which again, there have been very tenuous links between ethnic studies and geography. And I don't think that's the case anymore now, right? We get the rise of Black geography, specialty group, Latinx, really tremendous resurgence in terms of Native studies. And so I think we're seeing a whole another levels of innovation and theorization and knowledge production within geography that did not previously exist. But that's been a long time coming.
If you were to identify just one or two projects that you've been involved with that you feel most passionately about, or that you feel are most important, which wouldn't necessarily be the most cited ones, they might be, but I wonder what those might be.
Well, the first one that comes to mind would be A People's Guide to Los Angeles. I spent well over a decade on that. And if you don't know, The People's Guide, it's a radical tour guide that highlights sites of racial, class, gender, and environmental struggle in LA County's history and landscape. And that one meant a lot to me for a number of different reasons. Prior to that, most of my work in geography had been around environmental justice, as well as looking at social movements and political activism. And this was really grappling with questions of place and landscape. And, I went to graduate school at UCLA Urban Planning, and Ed Soja was on my committee. And he was always pushing me to grapple more with space, right? And I just I didn't get it. I didn't get it. I was really focused on environmental stuff, issues. And so I feel like Ed's presence in some ways in that, his pushing and nodding, all those years. And I feel that it had it's part of a wave, I think, of popular education projects focused on cities and power, right, and kind of counter hegemonic narratives and analyses. So I think I'm really, really proud of it. I think it's really good. It took a lot of time. It was a labor of love. And we have a book series now, a People's Guide book series with the University of California Press.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have books out on San Francisco, in Boston, Orange County, New York coming out this year, New Orleans. So we have books in the pipeline, and I'm really proud of that because I feel that's a way to connect with non-academics,
Right.
which I think is enormously important, enormously important.
It's great to hear you mention Ed Soja because he was an important early influence from afar, in my case, on my work. His writings on territory and territoriality actually figured into my early political geography work. So it's great to be reminded of that. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that you were driven by these why questions, maybe a little less than solutions. But of course, we all want to think about solutions a little bit, and we all want to think about ways of addressing the inequality problems we face, how to create and forge a more equitable future. And I wonder how your thinking about solutions might have evolved a little bit, or what you see as some of the things that we can do now to try to pave the way towards a more equitable future, large or small.
I do think about it a little bit. Yes, I think about it a lot, actually, because my students always ask me that, right? They want to know what they can do. And one of the first things I tell people is that we all need to, some of us more than others, we need to work on understanding and challenging white nationalism. I think that white nationalism in the United States, and perhaps other countries as well, but I'm very much of an Americanist in that way in my studies, I think it is a very powerful and damaging force for this country and the world. And that's, of course, because of our global status. We have implications. And I think white nationalism, it may be targeted at certain things, but it is so expansive and forceful, it spills over, and it impacts things that are seemingly unrelated to it, just because of the power and the energy and the fierceness that it has. And so I think and we can see this for in terms, I've been doing work around climate and thinking about climate change and how white nationalism impacts our inability or refusal to respond in a meaningful way. We see it right now in terms of the pushback against acknowledging the truth of this country in terms of its historical origins and the centrality of racial violence and white supremacy in the production of the United States. And it's leading to, we have militias out here in Eastern Oregon. I mean, it's a very powerful kinds of force that we're talking about. So I think this is incumbent on us first to understand it and to find ways to address it. And part of it, I'm increasingly thinking it has to be like empathy. There's got to be a little bit of empathy in there for understanding the other person's point of view, so we can begin to move forward in a meaningful kind of way. And I think it's especially incumbent upon white people to take on that work, as they have more kind of safe space to operate under, and they may be more listened to, right, compared to other people who are at least visibly, non-white. So I think that's a huge thing to do. But that also, of course, should be addressed at a policy level, right? It should be addressed in a political arena, but also that's the everyday work that all of us, I think, have to do.
And it seems clear when you talk about white nationalism, you're not just talking about the overt white nationalism of folks walking in protests and holding up signs. You're talking about the kind of implicit, unexamined even, ways that some people move through the world without actually thinking about how ideas that they haven't examined actually reflect in some ways a kind of white nationalist view of the world.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, I'm not talking about just the people at Charlottesville in 2017. Right. Not at all, not at all. Right, it's, there's some really good work coming, particularly out of political science, that talks about the pervasiveness, and it's probably at least a third of the U.S. population. So it's a very large percentage which embrace some of these values, and they've always been here. It's not new. It's just at a point now like we are actively challenging it. Many of us at least, want to do that and to move on to create a anti-racist society and work towards racial justice.
So with that in mind, I wonder if you'd just talk a little bit about the role that you think geography itself as a discipline, or people looking at the world geographically, can play in actually combating what you've been talking about, helping to forge a more equitable future.
Well, I think there's a couple of ways in which I think geography contributes or can contribute. Of course, the work that we're doing, geographers are doing right now, all is important in terms of, work around anti-racism, as well as within all realms of certainly human geography, I think, oftentimes has a kind of bent towards thinking about social justice and environmental justice. And we need to keep doing that and producing that kind of knowledge. And I know within the discipline, there's more attention to how do we make our work more translatable to the policy arena. The other thing that I would add to that also, I think there's enormous need for us to make our work accessible and meaningful to the mass public. So what are ways in which we can do that? And I know within different organizations within geography, there are awards being given out for public communication around that. And I think that's fantastic. And we need to keep doing that. And I think we need to be training the next generation of geographers to be thinking about issues of popular education, or whatever you want to call it, because that's where we need to be also working. It's not just, I think so much of our work is directed upwards towards policy, which certainly not unimportant, but it needs to equally be happening among the much larger population.
So if you could wave a wand, or let's say you were in control of a vast foundation and could fund 4 or 5 studies that you think ought to be done, geographical studies that ought to be done, or maybe are just beginning to be done and you'd like to see them expanded, that could help us address some of the issues we've been talking about, what are some ideas that you have that might be worth pursuing?
Oh, I don't know. Let's see. I think of things, but they're out of my area of specialty. Sure. So maybe they're being done already. Right. So, but I'll take a risk, I think a big one that needs to be done, and I know there's been a lot of work on this, is about immigration. And as we know, for example, during the Trump administration, there was a large outcry around the various kinds of immigration restrictions that were put in place. Which was great, that people thought that was dehumanizing. On the other hand, too, there's also an outcry, just that fact that they're coming. Immigrants are coming. That's a problem. I mean, people think the problem is that they're congregating at the border, and we need to protect our borders, and we need to keep ourselves safe, right? So that's a really, obviously, a mindset that is intensifies the problem, does not solve the problem. And we seem to have very little interest in actually figuring out why are the people coming, and is it possible to solve those problems? I don't know that it is, because this is only going to increase, of course, with climate change. We are entering into the moment of climate migration, and people are going to be coming from all different parts of the world. There's going to be all kinds of shifts. And so how do we prepare ourselves for this really coming new reality of mass migration on a scale that, I don't know how long it will play out. I don't know the degree. I just know it's going to happen, and it's going to be really severe. And if we keep on with the mindset that we have, that is just a recipe, again, going back also to white nationalism, for violence, for increasingly non-functional kind of society. So that would be one of the things certainly I think about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important set of points. And what about in the environmental justice arena, the area that's closer to you? I mean, you and I have both been involved with students and some of our own work that looks at the extraordinary inequalities in terms of just the environmental conditions of different communities in different places. Are there environmental issues that we're not focusing on? Are there environmental circumstances that we're not focusing on? Are there communities that we're not looking enough at to actually get a handle on just how broad and deep this environmental justice problem is?
I actually don't think that the landscape of environmental justice is not something we don't understand. I think that there's been enough work that we do have a pretty good grasp on what is causing these different forms of injustices. It's a little unclear, but we can make good guesses about what's going to happen too as the climate continues to change and different, we have really good projections, I think, about what's going to be happening. I think the issue is it's a lack of political will. And that's what we need to figure out how to address, because we have been unwilling as a society to tackle those issues. And in fact, even when legislation is passed, a lot of it is not particularly effective. And some of the responses, in fact, to climate change will further exacerbate existing social and environmental inequalities. So that's what I see, a huge lack of political will. So that's what I think we need to figure out versus looking at the inequalities themselves. It's like, how do we get action? How do we get traction, right? How do we, and part of it, the one thing that I'm hopeful about, or at least I was a little hopeful, like, when the last two, presidential campaigns with Bernie running, that was really important in terms of trying to put economic issues front and center on the political agenda. Super, super important. And I think that a lot of the environmental justice issues will not be solved without also addressing the economic inequalities. So it's how do we link those two things, and then how are we then able to generate the political will to actually act upon them? And we have not been able to do that, I think, successfully yet.
Yeah, this issue of having policy impact on environmental justice issues. I've even wondered sometimes if some of the kinds of geographic visualizations could be useful in trying to just communicate to the broader public and to policymakers just how dramatic the problem is in various cities and cities versus rural areas and so forth.
Absolutely. I mean, the work of kind of the old school idea of geography as maps is super powerful, right, in this day and age. And I've seen on numerous occasions the power of the map to really, oh, I get it, right? So we got to keep doing that kind of work. I've become like a huge fan of the New York Times and their infographics kind of work that they do, and I use it all the time in my classes. So very, very important. And that too is a really a key part of geography's popular education work.
Yeah, so let me just conclude with one question about what you see for you next. You've made all these interesting and important contributions in the various areas we've talked about. Can you just give us a few thoughts about where you see yourself going in the next couple of years?
In some ways, my work in environmentalism very much is continuing, but I'm not really focused on environmental justice in the conventional kind of way. I'm really focused very much on the right, what some people call political ecology is the far right. And I'm interested in the way in which race and white supremacy, white nationalism, how it operates in those different kinds of spheres and how that impacts the environment, particularly in terms of climate change. So that's one big area of work that I'm focusing on. The other one is work on cultural memory that I've been doing. I'm looking at different forms of historic sites and, again, ways in which they represent or don't represent questions of white supremacy. And I'm hoping to produce a historical atlas, actually, of that work. And it really is work about denial. And in some ways, both of those projects are about denial, the environmental work as well as the cultural memory. That's kind of one of my obsessions these days.
Well, thank you so much. This really has been an interesting conversation. I very much appreciate your sharing your thoughts and ideas, and congratulations again on your receiving the Cullum Medal.
And thank you. Appreciate the time to talk with you. I haven't seen you in person in a really long time. So if nothing, I'm just thankful for that opportunity.